Okay, so my name is Boris Baer, and I'm the director of the Center for Integrative Bee Research. So CIBER is basically, the idea behind CIBER is to bring beekeepers and researchers together on a table and to look at what the problems are or what the challenges are, and then to solve them together.
Our planet Earth, a world of mystery and imagination, science and wonder that is constantly being gazed upon and unraveled by the finest minds humanity has to offer. Welcome to the UNIVI podcast, the show that presents a free-flowing conversation with those beings at the very center of the world of academia and research from all around the globe, with your host, Simon Holland.
Hello and welcome to episode 12 of the UNIVI podcast, or should I say the UNIBee podcast. As in this episode, we go behind the scenes in a very important topic. Can you guess what that is? Of course you can. If you listen to this podcast, you're obviously incredibly bright and probably hate puns, so I shan't make any more of those. Dr. Baer is the director for the Centre of Integrative Bee Research, or CIBER, at the University of Western Australia. CIBER is the first large-scale organisation focused on honeybee research in Australia. It conducts research into an array of bee-related issues, including honeybee reproduction, immunity, ecology, and how best to protect bees from future decline. Without further ado, we welcome Dr. Boris Baer to the show. Can you tell us a little bit about the centre and what it does?
The centre is located at the University of Western Australia, and what we do is we basically connect different ends. So on the one end, we connect high-end research where people study at the university, do research there. We do that like ivory tower kind of environment. We connect it to the beekeeping industry. So CIBER is basically, the idea behind CIBER is to bring beekeepers and researchers together on a table and to look at what the problems are or what the challenges are, and then to solve them together. So that's one of these things that, one of the approaches that we take to link this. And the other thing that we would like to do is within kind of research, we bridge two very different fields of research. We have researchers that are very often divided in two types of researchers, and they study very different questions. They study how questions and why questions. The how kind of people are more interested in what sort of molecules, what sort of substances are in bees that they use, for example, for an immune system. And the why people are more behavioral ecologists, so they're more interested in ecology. They go out, they want to know, why is this bee not able to defend itself all of a sudden? What are the evolutionary forces behind it? Why did the bee evolve an immune system that is not efficient anymore? Things like that. So we try to bridge these two things as well. So all of a sudden we start to understand the functioning of an immune system, not just by single molecules, but also like, where are these molecules coming from, and can we adopt them or can we modify them by breeding or by looking at bees that are kind of specifically tolerant out in the field, and can we then use kind of clever techniques like artificial insemination or breeding programs to create bees that are able to kind of better defend diseases or deal with environmental stress and so on.
Now, I imagine this is a problem that is really of critical importance to the world over. Are you connected with other countries in terms of your research capacities, and do you share information? How are you guys integrating on this?
Yes, the bee problem is very global, and the people that work on this, I think they all realize that it is not really possible by a single brain, not even a single lab, to really resolve that. I think we need to take a very honey approach to find solutions. And what the honeybee does, if there's a problem, it's not just putting a single brain on a task. It puts like a network of, 1,000 brains on something, and then kind of works on the issue. And that's why we actively have like these collaborations all over the world. So at the moment we work with people in Copenhagen, in Denmark, in Beijing, in the US, in Riverside, and in Panama, for example, and try to kind of see what our ideas, what can we do, what our capacities to do things, what kind of machinery, what kind of approaches do we have, and can we work together to find clever solutions?
Can you tell us a little bit about your research?
I started to bee research about 10 years ago, so it hasn't left me. And I think by now it's actually not just me, it's an entire team that works on this. And we are basically interested in keeping bees alive and healthy. And to do this, we are interested in bee diseases and how the immune system of bees is able to defend diseases. We are interested in how the environment impacts bee health. So, for example, use of pesticides in agriculture, what effects that has on bee health. And we're interested in the reproductive biology of bees, because if we want to have bees around us for honey production, but also for pollination, we need to breed healthy bees. We need to breed better bees in the future. So we're having kind of projects that we run in all three of these different areas.
So tell us a little bit about the global importance of bees. There's a lot being said on the internet and science sort of popular sites about the importance of bees. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
And they're important for two reasons. First of all, for us humans. We keep bees because we need them to pollinate our crops. So as of today, in a highly economic agricultural setup, we use these bees to pollinate about 80 crops of agricultural interest. So about a third of what you eat depends on pollination by bees. And we need quite a lot of them. So we have like huge yards where we kind of grow different crops. So we need to come in with bees, and we have to provide millions and millions of bees to do the pollination of these flowers when the time is ripe to do so. But bees are also very important for the ecosystem. So they provide these sort of pollination services to the trees, to the plants, to the flowers that surround us, and that's important for seed production. So if you want to have new trees, if you want to have new plants, but these seeds, of course, are also food for other animals. So these are the two kind of services the bees provide for us. It's like production of food, but also kind of stability of the ecosystem.
So have bees evolved with plants to develop sort of a co-relationship, symbiosis there? Yes,
yeah. So that's a very long relationship, and they have perfectionized that. Bees are extremely good, especially honeybees are extremely good, because they cannot just pollinate a single plant or crop. They are actually quite flexible. They can pollinate a broad diversity of different things. And that's why we choose the bee thousands and thousands of years ago, because the bee is, first of all, producing bee colonies. So we have a lot of kind of these foraging animals around. And they're very broad in what they can pollinate. And there is a little kind of back of the envelope calculation that I've read at some point, that is that a fully grown honeybee colony consists of about 80,000 bees, and about half of them, so about 40,000 bees, can go out and forage for nectar and for pollen. And a bee can fly up to 10 k's out of the hive, but if you kind of assume she's flying 5 k's out and 5 k's back, that's about 10 k's per bee. So that's about 400,000 k's of transportation of pollen that each colony does each day. And if you kind of imagine that each of these bees can easily visit hundreds to thousands of flowers, we all of a sudden have like a single colony being able to have millions and millions of pollination events. And that's the power of the honeybee. And that's the power you need if you think about the huge field of canola or sunflowers or whatever. You have a lot of flowers there. So you need a pollinating insect that you bring in that has the power to do that pollination. And the honeybee is just perfect for that.
So bees are quite sensitive. I've read that they're sort of similar to frogs in a rainforest in terms of how they represent their ecosystem and the health of their ecosystem. Have you found that to be the case?
I think that's a little bit the new perception that is coming up, that we see the bees a bit as a bioindicator. So as long as the ecosystem is healthy and is running fine, we can see that the bees do well. If something goes wrong, the bees start to disappear and we lose them. And that's not just kind of honeybee that we keep. That also kind of that's also the case for other bees, like stingless bees or bumblebees in other parts of the world. So if we talk about losses of bees, we very often only kind of think about honeybees, but in fact, like that also is true for other bee species.
And globally, how the population's been going? What are the sort of factors that affect honeybee populations? And are there places that still have honeybee colonies intact?
Well, there's a lot of discussion about this, but what we know is that we have seen major losses of bees, certainly in some areas of the world. So in North America, in Europe, also in parts of Asia, we see massive declines, massive losses of bees. And in the most extreme cases, we have now areas where the farmers actually have to do the pollination by hand. So they climb into the trees and do kind of the pollination of apple trees, for example, with a little brush. We have some areas left that still seem to harbor very healthy bees. And one of these areas is Western Australia. And the reason for that is very clear. Western Australia very isolated from the rest of the world. There has been a complete ban to import bees over, I think, 20, 30 years by now. So a lot of the diseases have not really arrived in Western Australia. And that means we sit here on one of the last remaining healthy bee populations in the world.
Well, how does that fit into preserving bee colonies and bee health?
Well, that's very interesting because we have one of the very kind of rare situations here where we can still study healthy bees. If you look in other areas where bees are in decline and very often people don't know exactly why they lose all these bees, the question very often comes up is, so what is so different about these kind of bees that die compared to a healthy bee? So people look around and want to know, okay, what does a healthy bee actually look like? How does a healthy bee react? How does a healthy bee behave? What is the physiology of a healthy bee, and so on? And that's where Western Australia becomes really interesting because we can basically offer this here. We can still study these healthy bees and compare them to bees that are unhealthy. And that's much easier than to find out what's wrong with the bees that are in decline. And I think it's like for Western Australia, it would be very helpful to keep that status, so to keep the bees healthy as possible here. And that has been done. I already mentioned that in the past we have very strict quarantine regulations and they should be kept up and they should be enforced. In the long term, I think everyone in the industry and in research agrees that we're probably not evading some of these diseases because they have made it to this point to every other corner of the world. So they have arrived in New Zealand, they have arrived in Hawaii, on very remote islands. So sooner or later we will have to deal with these diseases in Western Australia as well. So one of the possible responses to that is, first of all, to kind of do the research locally, to be prepared when this happens. And the other thing is that the beekeeping industry is involved in this, for example, to set up breeding programs, to make sure that if we find bees that are better at, for example, defending parasites, that we can breed them and that we can redistribute them to beekeepers. So that if we get hit by something really bad, that we have faster ways to respond to such an incursion. And that is happening. Western Australia has one of the longest running and most successful kind of bee breeding programs in the world by now.
And what sort of research has been done into that immunology system of a bee? What sort of diseases can we expect? I know there's, mites and viruses and even STDs in some cases.
Yes. It's like the bee harbors quite a large number of different parasites. That's quite remarkable. So that, as you said, like that ranges from viruses to fungi to bacteria to mites to beetles, whatever. And that makes things a bit more complicated because very often if a colony starts to get sick, we are not dealing with a single disease or parasite. We very often then have to deal with a combination because when they are weakened, all of a sudden another parasite is coming in as well. What we found here, and that's quite remarkable, is that the bees that we have here, as I said before, they have been isolated. What has also been done here in Western Australia is that there is a complete ban of using any chemicals to treat bees when they are diseased. And that means we have not gotten in that treadmill where beekeepers throw insane amounts of chemicals on bees to suppress these bee diseases. And so what we see, and we have shown that in our research, is that the bees that we have locally here have some levels of resistance and tolerance against the diseases that are present. And I think that's really good news, because it shows that the honeybee in this case, is kind of able to maintain a very effective immune system and to defend these diseases if we let that bee do it.
Tell us a little bit about how you got into beekeeping yourself when you're young. Did it start when you were young, or is it something that came along later?
No, that started really early. It was interesting that my grandfather was a vet in a zoo in Zurich, and he invited me during my school break to follow him for a week, and I think that really triggered something in me, because I was in that zoo. We were kind of around animals really from dusk till dawn, and we looked at all these different animals, and we tried to help the sick ones. And that really excited me. That was the initial trigger to say, yes, I want to work with these animals as well. And right after that, you come home and you start to just look in your surroundings of what animals are actually around you. And I remember that as a boy, I was looking for bumblebee colonies in my parents' garden, and I had some bumblebee colonies there that I didn't keep them in the way I would have kept them later on in my career, but I knew where they are, and I looked at them, and that was like a fire that I got. And it's interesting that very often now when I'm working with children, or when I give presentations in schools or so, I see that these children kind of develop that same time of fire. With bees, you have a really easy go to get these children going. And in some cases, after a couple of years, they come back into my office and say, hey, here I'm again, but this time I'm not a high school student anymore. I started to study environmental sciences, or I'm doing my studies in biology now. And I think that is really satisfying. I think that's really cool.
And that really gets back to the fundamentals of science. It's just really using your eyes and your senses to experience the world around you.
Yes, your curiosity, right? You dare to ask questions, and you want to find something new out. And in this case, it's linked to something that is a real world problem. Something where people out there, in this case, for example, the beekeepers, have a real interest. They are really interested in how can we keep our bees healthy? How can we keep them alive? What possibilities do we have?
I always found that sciences can be quite intimidating for people. They can look at science and think that it's something that they could never do. Have you found that to be the case?
Yes, yeah. And that's a bit a pity, because I think we really miss the new generation of new scientists. It has become a field where people don't see a future, because it's so difficult to kind of get jobs afterwards. You travel around a lot, and so there are a lot of kind of negatives that are associated with research now, and I think that would not have to be. There is still that desire to find something new out, and that knowledge that you generate is helpful for something that is a global problem at the moment.
And now CIBER and yourself were also filmed in a movie that travelled all around the world looking at this bees problems. Can you tell us a little bit about the film and how CIBER fit into it?
Yeah, the film started, that is about 10 years ago. I think, yeah, it's about 10 years ago. We started to do research on bees, and we were increasingly more asked by people from the public to give talks or to go to schools and give presentations. And we realized that there is a huge demand for information about honeybees out there, but that the information that is available was very often wrong, or was not really correctly given, not correct in a scientific sense. And we had the idea that it would be really good to do a documentary about bees that basically tells the true story of the bee. So kind of to try to really be scientifically accurate, but to make a documentary out of it, to also show the connections between these bees and the beekeepers and kind of different people that are involved with bees and work with bees. And that resulted in a collaboration with a Swiss movie maker. And we provided the scientific evidence, we could help on the science side. We had the contacts to do this. And the beekeeper, or the movie maker, on the other hand, he was interested in telling stories about people and the opinions of what these people kind of work with bees in their kind of world that surrounds them and the bees. And I think it was a very interesting project because art all of a sudden met science, and that was quite a constructive environment that resulted then in the movie. But it took a while. I think it took 7 years to find the money and to do all the filming until the film was actually done. And we initially thought we see the movie kind of in the movie theaters or kind of mentioned every now and then for half a year, and then we use it basically for our outreach program. So if you go to schools, we can actually take the movie along. And the movie premiered in 2012, and we are still fully engaged with the movie. So there's still kind of requests to show the movie, to be there, to give background information about the movie and so on. So we were surprised by the impact and by the success that movie in the end had.
Yeah, and congratulations on moving on media as well. Trying to get that out there and doing it in such a novel way, I guess. Guys like David Attenborough, they've really made science popular and ignited whole generations of people to go into to natural sciences and beyond. And this was a very funny movie, by the way. I watched it, and it starts with a Swiss beekeeper.
Yes,
heading up the mountain to his beehive.
yeah.
And his no protection gear. It's like a really long shot as he's walking up the mountain, and then just a little bit about his life. That was hilarious. Is that what life's really like over in Switzerland? It looks like the old school, I guess. Yeah,
that is old school. It's interesting that in Switzerland you don't have the commercial beekeepers. They are not commercial in the sense that you would see in the US or in Australia. So the majority of beekeepers in Switzerland are still hobbyists. So they have 20, 30 hives or something like that. And they're still doing that way. And it's work. And it has become more work over the years because Switzerland was also hit by that mite. And there was a trend for a while that people gave up bees because it was too much work and you had to look after them and to buy medication and so on. And what I think we see now, and that's not just because of that movie, but because bees make headlines by now, is that there is a reverse trend. So more and more people want to learn how to keep bees, more and more people want to keep bees. And that's not just in Switzerland, that's also, for example, in Australia, in the US. So we see that reverse trend now, that beekeeping all of a sudden is something that people want to do and want to do even in the cities.
Yeah, it's true. It's a little bit like craft beer. It sort of has gone from a big factory-produced thing, breaking down to people taking pride in what they do and having a deep interest in it.
Yes, and in the end, it's interesting that if you talk to people, very often they come up with statements like, oh yeah, my grandfather had bees or my uncle had bees, but then they gave them up because of that reason. And so there is very often a link that there will be somewhere in the family, and now that's coming back, and people are very interested to link up and to learn that skill again. It's not so easy to keep bees, certainly not keep bees healthy. So that's quite good, and I think it's important to bring the bee back also into suburban areas because they're part of, as I said, the environment. And people are intuitively fascinated by bees because it's like we're a social animal and bees are social animals. So if you work with them, it's sometimes a bit like a mirror, right? So you look into a system that has remarkable similarities with our societies, but then some things are really, really different.
And also, honey's delicious and very useful.
Yeah, of course. Honey is what kind of initially kind of set up that love relationship between humans and bees. And we think there could be up to 40,000 years old where people saw honey bees somewhere in the trees and they went up there, and in the beginning they just destroyed the nest. But very soon they realized if they do that, then the nest is gone. So beekeepers started to not destroy the nest, but only go for the honeycomb. And we can still see some of these behaviors, for example, in some Asian rainforests. And that was the first step of domestication of an animal. And that basically means that the honeybee is one of the oldest domesticated animals that mankind has. So we have a very long tradition with these animals. And you can see that, right? You can see that throughout history. The Egyptians, the Babylonians, they all kept bees, and bees played a very important role in their daily life.
Can we talk a little bit about honey and some of the properties? A lot's been said about honey in terms of its health properties and also cure for this and that. What amount of that is true? What kind of things are true? Is it microbial? Does it vary from place to place? And how does West Australian honey fit into that? Honey
is an extremely complex thing in the end. And as you already indicated, it really depends where the bees go and what they collect. So typically for a beekeeper, the purer the honey is, the higher the value. So if you have a pure Jera or pure white gum honey, then that is of high value. And depending on what's in that honey, then it depends what the properties are of that honey. And some of these honeys are antimicrobial, we know that. So that is well established that you can use honey for wound healing. So if you have in hospitals, if they have problems that some wounds are not closing, you can add honey to that, and that accelerates the healing process. And then we have honeys like Manuka. They are marketed as such. They have high antimicrobial activity, and people are interested to buy them. And that gives additional income to the beekeeper. So they are very interested to produce this type of honeys. I just like to have just different honeys. I think if you ever have the chance to go to a market where a beekeeper is present and he can let you taste all the different honeys that the same bees have produced, that's actually remarkable. You should really do that, because it's really, if you taste them next to each other, you realize how different the taste of that honey is. And some of them you really like, and others you don't like. But especially the Western Australian honeys have very very intense and very good flavors, and that's why they are looked for throughout the world. And I think what we also have here in Western Australia is what I would define as the greenest, cleanest honey in the world. The beekeepers here are not using their bees for pollination, because we still have a lot of wild bees that do this. So they're going into the forest and in crown land, and they produce very pure honey from different eucalypts and other plants. So we have very pure white gums, red gums, Jera, and so on. And there are no contaminations in there. There are no contaminations from agriculture crops. There are no kind of pesticides in there. So they are very, very green and clean honeys, and they're produced with very healthy bees.
I'm a bit like that with apple. So if I find a type of apple I like, I love pink ladies at the moment. And if I ever try to experiment, I go to say I pick up a Golden Delicious, and it's not very flavoursome compared to what I was after. So honey is a lot like that. Different varieties, really different properties.
Yes, and some of them you don't get every year. So for some of the honeys, the beekeepers have to wait for years, sometimes 5, 6, 7 years, until that type of tree comes back in flower. And it's not so easy to trace that down. So the beekeeper has to go and into these areas and actually make sure that there was enough rain, so the trees start to put on buds, and then he has to predict the flowering. And then when that happens, he brings the bees in for a very short but specific time to harvest that honey. So beekeeping is not just about keeping the bees alive. It's also understanding a lot about nature and ecology in which that kind of love affair between the bees and the plants actually happens. And then, as I said, if the beekeeper gets it right and he has the bees at the right time in the right spot, he gets these incredibly good harvests of eucalypt honey in Australia. But for example, in Tasmania, you would have Manukas, and in other parts of the world, you have other crops that make really nice honey.
Is there investigations into the microbial properties of honey? Because it's amazing that we've nearly exhausted our supplies of antibiotics, which is probably one of the major problems facing the world that is kind of flying under the radar at the moment. And it's something that will sort of insidiously affect the population in the future. How is it that something as old as honey and as commonly used as honey can still maintain its microbial factors when antibiotics and modern medicine can fail?
antimicrobial effects that we have in honey are very generic ones. So these are kind of molecules that we know have antimicrobial properties. And you have to see that honey is a product that has a very long shelf life. So what I've been told is that they found honey in the tombs of the Egyptians. So if the pharaoh died, honey was provided to him in his tomb, because the honey was seen as the tear of the highest god in Egypt. And some of these honeys were more than 3,000 years old, and obviously you can still eat it. So it kept it. And that's where the antimicrobial kind of properties come in, right? So the honey is produced in a way to keep over very long periods of time, and the bees are doing this. And if you ask me how they avoid that, some of these of the possible bacteria or fungi they could overcome that protection that is in there and go after the honey, I don't really know how they do that. I think one secret that we know is that if the bee collects the nectar and the pollen, a lot of the water is removed, so the sugar content is really high. And that is not a nice environment where a lot of kind of bacteria and fungi can survive. So that this high sugar content and low water content is probably part of the secret. But I'm sure if we start to really investigate honey in all its details and the properties that it has, there is a lot that it can still be discovered.
Yeah, so they say space is the final frontier, but bees are one of those things. There's a lot of mysteries that we're sort of slowly unraveling. Actually, yes. In the film, it showed lots of some of the things that they've discovered by tracking individual bees' flight paths and the shaking of the tail. Tell us a little bit about those bee mysteries, I guess we'll call them.
I think everyone who kind of remembers a picture of a bee probably sees a frame and there are all these kind of bees on it. And for us, it looks like complete chaos. It can't be chaos because you have these 80,000 individuals and each of these individuals has a very defined job and knows exactly what to do. So the only way you can do that is by information transfer. And that is done in different ways. So there are the language of the bee is not necessarily sound-based like our one. It's smell-based. So bees release a lot of pheromones and substances that they use to communicate with each other. They can also use that to store information on the frames, for example. And then is the very famous kind of way how they communicate to each other where a food source is. So if a special bee that is a scout bee flies around in the landscapes and finds a huge tree that has started to flower, that bee will fly home. And in the hive, in complete darkness, that bee is dancing. It's dancing for her sisters. And the dance looks like an 8 on the frame. And depending on how that 8 is placed on the frame, that the number 8 that bee dances, that encodes the direction and the distance of where the food source is. And the more excited the bee is, because if a bee sees a huge flower tree, she's very excited, so she's coming home. And that excitement of dancing more vigorously, that recruits more other bees to go there. So she can also kind of send a certain amount of bees into that direction to exploit that food source. So bees, if it comes down to kind of finding food and bringing food home, they dance to each other to get that information transferred.
One of the most marvelous things I thought about the film, if we can go back to the More Than Honey, was the way that the farmers manipulated the actual system that the bees had, so that the dancing and the interaction with the queen, and manipulated that to breed them. It's still it's sort of almost like hacking the bee system, isn't it?
Yes and no. I wouldn't overestimate like what we can do. It's still like a very complex animal. And we have some ways how we can intervene, but others is pretty much beyond of what we can do. It's still a bee colony. It's still like 80,000 little kind of brains, and they have their own will. So as soon as you start to keep bees, you realize that they have their own will and they have their own way how they do it. So your ways to manipulate the system is, I would still think, very limited. But yes, that's true. It's like, as with every other kind of animal that we keep, we manipulate these animals. So we have manipulated dogs and pigs and cows and horses. And we try to do the same with the bee, right? Because we want to have bees that produce a lot of honey. We want to have bees that don't sting us a lot and so on. So we try to kind of manipulate that bee in one or the other way. And, it's like, it's a question like how much can we do it or how much should we do it and how much do we have to acknowledge that is an individual that needs it to have its own degrees of freedom because that keeps it healthy and that guarantees that we have this animal around in 5, 10 and 50 years.
So that's almost like that's a massive marketing strategy actually, especially when you're talking about food in 2016, is about claiming something is non-GMO. Is that necessarily a good thing? And in particular in terms of honey and bees?
Well, bees are not GMO, right? There are no kind of genetically modified bees around and the consumer would never accept that at this point. I think from the beekeeper's perspective, GMO is risky because he can't determine where these bees go. So, for example, if you want to import honey into the EU, into the European community, you need a certificate that your honey is not containing any genetically modified organisms. And if your bees fly to a canola crop that is genetically modified, you can produce the best possible honey, but it will still be kind of seen as a genetically modified organism. So I think beekeepers worried about GMOs, especially if they cannot avoid that the bees are flying there. But the bees themselves is like, I think what we use for bees to this point is still very traditional breeding techniques. I think the most sophisticated way that we try to manipulate bees is with artificial insemination, but that's nothing that is used on a commercial level. So you use artificial insemination as a possibility to, for example, get a new genotype or a new kind of genetic variant into a breeding program. To run the breeding program, you let the bees mate by themselves. And that's done once a year where these bees from the breeding program are put on a huge island in front of Perth where they mate with each other. And then like a next generation of bees is taken back to the mainland and assessed over the next year.
It's very funny about how you talk about bee personalities. And I think one of the funny things was in the film, there was an American guy. So it was kind of like mainly based in Switzerland and almost juxtaposed the Swiss model and the Australian models with the current American model. And the American model was in the almond plantation with huge thousands of acres of almond trees. And a poor little beekeeper was trying to sort of work around the fumigation scenario, that kind of thing. He was getting very frustrated. He was kind of like a freelance moving bee farm keeper guy industry. And he's there was another guy who was having trouble with the Africanized bees coming in and having just really intense personalities. What are African bees? The killer bees, that was a big thing in, 10, 20 years ago.
Yeah, so the Africanized bee, that's a crossbreed between two bee species. And that was done in a laboratory in Brazil. And they escaped. So that was not good.
That's not good.
It was pretty bad. And these bees are more aggressive than the bees that we are used to. There have been a lot of horror stories about Africanized bees that sometimes they are referred to as killer bees. I think that's not really accurate. So I think what we deal with is that we have different types of bees, and the Africanized bee is one of them. And these bees have different levels of aggression. So if you approach this type of bees, you have to be more careful, or if you want to really handle them, you have to be more protective compared to the bees that, for example, we breed here in Western Australia. But these wild bees or these different kind of bees, they provide genetic diversity or genetic variation in traits. For example, the Africanized bee has not a really big problem to deal with diseases, certainly not with that very vicious kind of mite. So these bees also have something that could help us in the long term. And the same is true in Western Australia. So we don't have Africanized bees here because we never imported kind of bee material over the last kind of decades. But even in our bees here, you can see differences between bees. So some of them are kind of have more character and others have different or kind of are more tame and easier to handle. I actually like the ones that have a little bit more character. I think we can learn a lot from these bees, especially if you look at wild bees, so the bees that are non-managed. So if you walk around in parks or in the forest, every now and then if you look up a tree, you can see that there's a bee nest. And these bees are typically they're more aggressive. They're not chasing you and killing you, but they will defend the nest if you start to annoy them. But they survive without human intervention. So they get infected by diseases. They have to cope with very harsh climatic conditions, certainly here in Western Australia during the summer. And they survive. And I think these bees have something that we could take advantage of. And I see them a little bit as a Swiss bank account. It's not an account with money on it. It's an account where we have genetic diversity on it, and we should withdraw some of these assets because we could use that to produce bees that are healthy and that remain healthy even if they get hit by something nasty in the future.
And how do you find reactions when you're going into schools and you're doing programs with general public? Because kind of when you say the word bee, it's probably a 50-50 split. Half the people will associate honey and the other half will associate being stung. How do you find people's public reaction? Is stinging still something that they're scared of?
Not really. I'm actually surprised how easy it is to get people excited about bees because there's so many stories you can tell. There's this, what I already said before, there's this intuitive there's this deep interest of people to look at that animal. Maybe because they had somebody in the family who had it, but also because it's an animal that in one or the other way reflects our own societies. So it's really easy to break the ice and to get people excited by bees. I have very few people that actually are scared or that are very skeptical about bees. And that has also changed over the last 5-10 years as the news spread that there's something wrong with the bees, that we lose them. A lot of people already know that we need them for pollination, and so they're not necessarily only making the link to honey. I think the idea that these bees are important for our food production, I think that is quite widespread by now.
Why do bees sting? That's something that it always seems like a massive problem for them if they die when they sting. Why is that something that they would do?
Well, these animals are, what you have is a colony, and the colony consists of a single queen, and all the other animals that you see there are basically the offspring, the daughters of that one queen. And so for an individual bee, the bees that we see flying around are these workers. They cannot reproduce. So what they want is to do the best for the colony. So they basically live in the perfect kind of socialistic environment. And that means that if something comes along where the individual bee thinks that is threatening the colony as a whole, it will defend that colony. That's what we do as well. Every kind of nation on the planet maintains an army. But in the case of the bees, they sacrifice themselves. So if a bee stings you, the bee actually dies. So the stinger stays in your skin. And by doing so, if the bee flies away, that actually releases a pheromone that attracts more bees. So if a first bee stings you, first of all, you feel not very comfortable. So you have maybe second thoughts whether you go closer to the colony and to the honey. And there are not just humans that steal honey. There are a lot of other animals that are after the honey and the larvae as well. And secondly, you get marked as that bee basically marks you as an enemy. So it starts to attract other bees. And that's where, like I said before, character, that's where like this aggressiveness comes in. So different bees or different bee breeds or different bee species have different, we call that threshold. So how much do you actually need until the next bee comes along and stings you as well? So the Africanized bees, obviously you need very few or only one sting that is sufficient to attract another kind of bee to attack you and sting you. Whereas with the bees that we have here and that we breed here and keep in boxes, a single sting doesn't make a difference. The other bees just kind of continue to do their normal business.
I had no idea that's how that worked. So the sting is a marker.
Yeah, it's a marker. And as I said, they communicate with a lot of odor. Some of that we can smell. So the alarm pheromone of bees you can smell. It's a bit like lemonish, banana-like. I think you can buy it online.
Sounds delicious.
Yeah, well, yeah. I don't know. It depends where you are, right? If you're away from bees, that's fine. I wouldn't kind of put it on a perfume when you go to the bee yard.
Now, if people would like to learn more about bee research and also CIBER itself, how can they get involved?
Well, we have a website where we have kind of the general information. We have a Facebook page where we, on a regular basis, we upload information there. So we normally don't repost things on Facebook. It's really kind of, we keep that CIBER Facebook page just for the things that we do. So whenever we publish a paper or when we have some activity coming up or anything like that, we put that on Facebook so people can basically stay connected and also kind of comment on it when they want. Otherwise, we have outreach activities that we are involved with. So we show the movie every now and then. We have exhibitions that travel around. Every year we have a honey festival that we organize together with the beekeepers where we are, and people can come and we show them bees. So we have little hives where you can actually look into a hive. And we show them the bees and what they do at the moment. So I think there are kind of different ways how you can keep connected. Either you can do that from home over the internet, but just kind of looking at websites, or you can visit us whenever we are somewhere. So
the CIBER web address is www.ciber, that is ciber.science.uwa.edu.au.
Exactly. And there are also links to the other sites. From there we have a blog where we kind of give a little bit more detailed information and so on. I think the CIBER website is a good entry point for this.
Yeah, actually, really helped me with doing research for this chat, because you've got all your research really easily accessible. Contact us, links to the movie. Yeah, it's a really good, well-maintained website. And I really encourage listeners to go along and try and see one of those movie nights, More Than Honey. It's narrated by John Hurt, and he just has the perfect voice for it, I think. It is a very funny movie. It's very educational as well. It's designed to be educational, but there are lots of little funny bits in there that is really quite fun to watch. Okay, Boris, well, thank you very much for coming on the show and telling us everything you do.
Thanks a lot. It was a pleasure.
Well, that's all we have time for this week. Thank you for listening to the UNIVI podcast. To follow our series, please subscribe to our channel via iTunes, Beyond Pod, or the equivalent service. And if you particularly enjoyed the show, please don't forget to rate. For further information, news, videos, and articles, head to univi.com.au.